In the immediate wake of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, two friends exchanged letters. A fellow named Curtis in Detroit wrote to his dear friend in Tulsa, Oliver. Oliver replied,
Dear Oliver, I am, by our local newspaper, fully advised of the whole terrible tragedy there. Now that they have destroyed your homes, wrecked your schools, reduced your business places to ashes, and killed your people, I am sure that you would rapidly give up the town and move north. Enclosed, please find a draft for $40 to purchase your ticket to Detroit. We'll be expecting you, Curtis.
Dear Curtis, how kind of you to volunteer your sympathetic assistance. It is just like you to be helpful to others in times of stress like this. True it is, we are facing a terrible situation. It is equally true that they have destroyed our homes, they have wrecked our schools, and they have reduced our churches to ashes, and they have murdered our people. Curtis, but they have not touched our spirit. And while I'll speak only for myself, let it be said that I came here and built my fortune with that spirit. I shall reconstruct it here with that spirit, and I expect to live on and die here with it. Oliver.
how do we bind the wounds of our historical racial trauma? How do we heal our history, our often hidden history, excluded from dialogue, discussion, and debate, excluded from curricular materials? Now, I've studied, written about, and lectured on Tulsa's historic Greenwood District for well over 2 decades now. And I've come to believe that there's a 3-part process that will lead our community and communities all across the land that have experienced historical racial trauma farther along the road to reconciliation. That process involves acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. Acknowledgement, that first prong, it really means confronting our history. Now, if we look at the black community in Tulsa, known as the Greenwood District, later dubbed Black Wall Street for its incredible economic and entrepreneurial prowess, we can see that it began in 1906. A fellow named O.W. Gurley, a wealthy businessman from Arkansas, migrated to Oklahoma in the land run in 1889. He wound up in Tulsa, bought land, used some of the land for his own businesses, which included a grocery store and a hotel, sold other parcels of that land in the Greenwood District to other African Americans. After Gurley established a grocery store in 1906, businesses proliferated in the Greenwood District. There were beauty salons and barbershops, pool halls, dance halls, rooming houses, garages, confectionaries. There were all manner of businesses, including pharmacies, clothiers, haberdasheries, and on and on and on. This was essentially a black Main Street. These were small business enterprises and service providers like doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants. To give you an example of the sophistication of the business people in the Greenwood community, let me tell you about 2 individuals. One is Simon Berry. Simon Berry owned and operated a jitney service. A jitney is like a taxi cab. So he had a Model T Ford, and for a nickel a ride, he would shuttle people anywhere around in the Greenwood District that they wanted to go, and he made a lot of money doing that. He saw the need for a greater transportation service, so he started a bus line. So successful it was that it was bought from him by the city of Tulsa. Simon Berry was also a pilot, so he started a charter plane service. Among his clients were some of the wealthy oil barons in and around Tulsa. Tulsa at this time, of course, was on an upward trajectory toward becoming the self-described oil capital of the world. Simon Berry also owned the Royal Hotel, one of several boutique hotels in Tulsa's Greenwood community. Dr. A.C. Jackson was a prominent black surgeon in the early part of the 20th century, right here in Tulsa. The Mayo brothers, as in the Mayo Clinic, called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. And even in rigidly segregated Tulsa, Oklahoma, He had patients who were white and patients who were black. Truly remarkable. We have this incredible economic and entrepreneurial activity going on in Tulsa's Greenwood district in the early part of the 20th century. We come to the period of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, there are a number of systemic, institutional, and structural issues that really undergirded the massacre, but I want to tell you about the trigger incident. Tulsa in 1921 was a tinderbox, a powder keg, needing only some sort of catalyst to be thrown on these smoldering embers that would cause the great conflagration that was the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. That trigger incident involved two teenagers, a 19-year-old black boy, Dick Rowland, who shined shoes for a living, a 17-year-old white girl, Sarah Page, who operated an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. It was Monday, May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland, busy shining shoes downtown, needed to use the restroom. Facilities were limited because of segregation, but Dick Rowland knew of a restroom facility on the third floor of the downtown Drexel Building. He walked over to the Drexel Building, entered, boarded the elevator being operated by young Sarah Page. Something happened on that elevator. We don't know exactly what it was, but it caused the elevator to jerk or to lurch. Dick Rowland bumped into Sarah Page, and Sarah Page began to scream. The elevator landed back in the lobby. Dick Rowland, frightened, ran from the elevator. Sarah Page exited the elevator into the arms of a clerk from a locally owned store called Renberg's. He comforted her. She told him her story about being assaulted in the elevator. He was concerned and he called the police. Now, Sarah Page would ultimately recant the original story. She would acknowledge to authorities that nothing untoward happened on that elevator. She would refuse to cooperate with prosecutors after Dick Rowland was arrested for assault. Dick Rowland was taken to jail, which sat atop the courthouse. The sheriff was Sheriff McCullough. A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse, in part because of the reportage of a local newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune. Now, the day after the elevator incident, the Tribune, this afternoon daily newspaper, published a story entitled "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." It was a false narrative. It was a scandalous, scurrilous tale of an attempted rape in broad daylight in a public building in downtown Tulsa. The Tribune article went out of its way to make Sarah Page, who was of questionable repute, virtuous. And as a corollary, it made Dick Rowland look villainous. And thus, the large white mob that gathered on the lawn of the courthouse threatening to lynch Dick Rowland. Now, black men got wind of these rumors of a lynching, and they were concerned. Several dozen black men, some of them World War I veterans, some of them with weapons who knew how to use those weapons, marched down to the courthouse to protect Dick Rowland. They were confronted by the much larger white mob, which numbered ultimately in the thousands. There were words exchanged between the two groups. A white man tried to take the gun held by a black man, and the gun discharged. And in the words of one of the massacre survivors, all hell broke loose after that. The violence of the massacre lasted roughly 16 hours, quelled by a unit of the National Guard sent in from Oklahoma City. When the dust settled, some 100 to 300 people were killed, most of them black. Among those who died was Dr. A.C. Jackson, that prominent black surgeon I mentioned earlier. He was accosted at his home on Detroit Avenue. He exited his house, hands held high in surrender, but was gunned down by a young white man. Dr. Jackson bled to death. In addition to the fatalities, hundreds of folks were injured. At least 1,250 homes in the black community were destroyed. A number of businesses, churches, schools, and a library were destroyed as well. Property damage, conservatively estimated, ranged from $1.5 to $2 million in 1921. That translates into well over $25 million today. And again, that's a lowball estimate. Some Black Tulsans were interned in these detention centers throughout the city, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned during World War II. And they had to have a green card, an identification card, countersigned by a white person to get them released from these detention centers. Many Black families spent days, weeks, and months living in tent cities set up by the American Red Cross, which by all accounts did a yeoman's job in terms of providing health care, food, shelter, and clothing post-massacre. This narrative really, though, centers on the human spirit, because what's remarkable here is that the Black community vowed that they would not be moved. Most Black Tulsans remained in place. They borrowed money and they did what they had to do to survive and ultimately to thrive. They began rebuilding even as the embers still smoldered from the massacre. The Black community in Tulsa, economically, Black Wall Street, reaches its peak in the early to mid 1940s with well over 200 Black-owned and operated businesses in the community. The economic fortunes of the Black community turned south in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on account of integration, urban renewal, and a host of social, economic, and political factors. And today the community is integrated, it's growing, it's an amalgam of different kinds of interests: residential, commercial, educational, cultural, religious, and on and on. It's a community in search of unity and in search of a new identity, a new iteration of Black Wall Street. I have the privilege of serving as the education chair for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. And we're working on that three-pronged process that I mentioned earlier: acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. We're working to share this history with the world through documentaries, through public service announcements. We run a summer teachers institute that teaches teachers not only the substantive history, but pedagogy, how to teach the history to various audiences. We're building a pathway to hope that connects important sites in the Greenwood District and elevates the founders of the community, the originals of Black Wall Street. We're building Greenwood Rising, a world-class multi-million-dollar history center that will tell this story in an immersive, experiential way, and will allow our patrons to leverage this history to grapple with some of the challenges that we face around race today: Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, and on and on and on. And finally, we are working to rekindle the Black Wall Street mindset, that can-do spirit around economics and entrepreneurship. I want to give you a more concrete example of that three-pronged process I mentioned earlier: acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. The Tulsa Chamber of Commerce was around in 1921. It was a big player in the community at that time. The current chamber leadership, aware of the pendency of the 100th anniversary of the massacre, decided to look back to see what the chamber's role was in 1921. The leadership was stunned at the various acts of omission and commission on the part of the chamber that really impeded progress in the Black community in the run-up to and post-massacre. The CEO of the chamber, Mike Neal, decided to host a press conference. He held it at the Greenwood Cultural Center, the leading history repository in the community today. At this press conference, he acknowledged the chamber's dereliction of duty back in 1921. He donated to the Greenwood Cultural Center relevant portions of the 1921 chamber minutes to preserve them for posterity. He apologized. He expressed sorrow for the actions of the chamber back in 1921. And he moved a step further to atonement. He talked about what the current chamber is doing in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, both internally as an organization and externally as a convener of business interests throughout the community. He talked about initiatives and opportunities specifically for African American economic progress in Tulsa: acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. Now, I know that you're wondering, what can you do? You're just one person, but there are a number of options. First and foremost, self-awareness. introspection. Learn about yourself, your background, your culture. Explore your biases, explicit and implicit. There are a number of tools available for your use online and in your community. Join with organizations in your community, and there are many that center their mission on fighting bias, bigotry, and racism. Work with your school board member on a more inclusive curriculum, a people's history of the United States, whereby the rich mosaic that really is America is represented and reflected in our history books. Work with your elected officials, local, state, federal, on some of the disparities that we know exist across lines of race, ethnicity, and culture. Disparities in education, criminal justice, healthcare, employment, housing, and on and on and on. And finally, you can do something as simple as dinner and dialogue. This is an idea promoted by Oklahoma Senator James Langford. Invite somebody from a different racial, ethnic, or cultural group to your home, your intimate space for dinner. Have dinner, but also have a conversation about something that is important to the community, something meaningful. But it's not about the substance or the topic of the conversation. It's really about the conversation itself. It's about building relationships, because relationships are essential to trust, and without trust, there is no reconciliation. So how do we bind the wounds of our historical racial trauma? How do we heal our history, our often hidden history, excluded from dialogue, discussion, and debate, excluded from curricular materials? Well, we do that by tearing down the walls that have too long divided us. Walls built around ignorance and hate and fear and blame and shame. We do it by building the bridges that connect us across our shared humanity. Thank you.